Well, hello and welcome. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. And you are here with me live on AASR Live, our biweekly video podcast series that we broadcast live every 2 weeks, generally on Thursday at 3:30 Eastern Time, which, of course, all over the world is a lot of different times. And we are here generally talking about topics related to really a broad spectrum of things. While we started out very focused on restraint seclusion, of course, we look at restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, many things that are often happening to kids and youth in school. We're focused on things like the school to prison pipeline. But even more broadly, what we're really looking at is all the things that are often really being done to children and youth and others in the name of behavior, and really trying to focus on what are better ways of supporting children, youth, and really ourselves. So we do a lot of work around trauma-informed approaches, neuroscience-aligned approaches, relationship-driven approaches, and collaborative approaches. And we are doing work and have a vision around, creating safer schools for kids, teachers, and staff. But it's even really much larger than that. I really believe firmly that a lot of this work that many of us are involved in is work that is going to lead to a better world. And I know that sounds really ambitious here on a Thursday afternoon, but I really do have a lot of belief and a lot of hope. And in fact, our guest today gives me a lot of belief and a lot of hope as well. So let me tell you, I am really excited today to have Dr. Sandra Bloom joining us for a special interview. And Dr. Bloom is known for her pioneering work in the field of traumatic stress studies. Dr. Bloom is an innovator and someone that is led to and leading to a lot of positive change in the world. So I'll tell you more about Dr. Bloom in a moment. I do want to let you know that, as always, today's session is being recorded. Of course, it's being broadcast live on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, but they're also being recorded on those platforms. So you can go back later and watch them on any of those platforms. You can, of course, also listen to an audio podcast version. We have an audio only version that's available on on iTunes, on Spotify, any place that you might listen to audio podcasts. So with that, let's get to the really exciting part. And before I do, I just want to say, and some people may have already gotten this. Oh, okay, Amy, you asked, is this being recorded for watching later? Yes, not only is it being recorded to watch later, we encourage you to watch it later, and we also encourage you to share it. So by recording it, you can share it with others folks that might be on a journey of trauma-informed care, of trying to do better. So absolutely. I do want to just ask people real quickly, before I bring on Sandy and kind of introduce her, tell us who you are and where you're from. So in the chat, let us know who you are, where you're joining us from, anything else you want to share with us as well. It's always a lot of fun to share with our guests where people are coming from today. And it's amazing to see that we often have people from all over the world that are joining us. So with that, let's go ahead and get to the really exciting part of this. Let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Sandra Bloom. Sandy, I'm really excited to have you here today. I'm going to kind of go through your introduction here. And of course, you've done a lot, so I've got a good introduction for you that covers a lot of ground. But let me get through that, and we're going to get started in a moment on a really exciting conversation. So Dr. Sandra Bloom is a board-certified psychiatrist at Temple University School of Medicine graduate, and currently associate professor of health management and policy at the Dornsife School of Public Health, Drexel University. For the past 40 years, Dr. Bloom has done pioneering work in the field of traumatic stress studies. From the 1980s to 2001, Dr. Bloom served as founder and executive director of the Sanctuary Programs, inpatient psychiatric programs for treatment of trauma-related emotional disorders. And during those years was also the vice president of the Alliance for Creative Development, a multidisciplinary outpatient practice group. Dr. Bloom is recognized nationally and internationally as the founder of the Sanctuary model. And since 2012, Dr. Bloom has also served as the co-chair for the Philadelphia ACEs Task Force. In 2020, Dr. Bloom introduced a new online organizational and clinical approach called Creating Presence, and we'll share the link in the chat as well. And Creating Presence is for creating trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, and trauma-resilient organizations. Wow, that's really important work. We often see, not to go off script here for a second, but we often see people talking about practicing trauma-informed approaches, but you can't do that outside of a trauma informed trauma responsive organization. Your organization has to be part of what you're doing. Dr. Bloom is a past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. Dr. Bloom originated and has written a series of books on trauma-informed care. I actually have one of them sitting next to me here, Creating Sanctuary Towards the Evolution of Sane Societies, published in 1997. The second edition in 2013, Destroying Sanctuary, The Crisis in Human Delivery Service Systems, published by Oxford Press in 2010, and Restoring Sanctuary, a new operating system for trauma-informed systems of care. And actually have that one sitting on my desk here with me today. And you've authored and published dozens of chapters and articles, as well as we've got SELF, a trauma-informed group psychoeducational curriculum. And all of these, of course, can be found on your website, which is sandrabloom.com, which we'll share. And finally, I'll mention that you are a founder and currently the chair of the board of directors for a national organization called CTIPP, the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. And we'll share that link as well. And the goal of that organization is to advocate for public policies and programs at the federal, state, and local level and tribal levels to incorporate up-to-date scientific findings regarding the relationship between trauma across the lifespan of many social and health problems. Really important work. CTIPP was awarded the Distinguished Service Award for 2019 from the American Psychiatric Association. And we've actually had the pleasure of working with folks over at CTIPP as well. Of course, Jesse Kohler, who has been a guest here on the show, and it's very sad to learn about the passing of Dan Press not long ago. But Dan and Jesse were absolutely phenomenal, and Jesse, I know, is very, actually I got a chance to run into him kind of randomly in Houston. He was there for a Trauma Informed Educators Conference, and I'm like, wait, it's Jesse. So really, this is a lifetime of work in doing things that are changing the way that people are looking at things, that are making a huge difference. So it's really exciting to have you here today. I think when we think about the trauma-informed space, when we think about trauma-informed care, you are you are a rock star out there. Somebody that it's like, oh gosh, I get to talk to Dr. Sandra Bloom. How exciting is this? Just really thrilled to have you here. So anyway, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for making some time to have a conversation with me.
Thanks for having me, Guy. I'm very excited to be here because I don't think real fundamental change is going to happen unless you and the people who are listening to this really insist on substantial change in our mental health system. So I'm very happy to be here.
Absolutely. And even beyond that, I was listening to a presentation that you were giving at one point, and it's in the fabric of our society. So many of the things and places. I mean, I started the organization here, the Alliance, in response to my surprise to find out that my neurodivergent son was being physically restrained and secluded at school, and quite frankly traumatized. When in fact, if people were aware of trauma-informed approaches, if people were aware of some of the neuroscience, these things wouldn't be happening like they were and like they continue to happen. So, these things, I think about some of the things I've heard you say. I think about so many others. Stephen Porges has kind of famously said, you want to make a better world, you start by making people feel safer. And so much of that is tied into the work that you've been doing, but also this idea that it's not just going to change. We've got to do things. We've got to take action to make things change. And that's a lot what our group is about. But I want to hear more about, kind of your journey and all of this as well. I will mention again, tell us who you are and where you're from in the chat. I do see here a friend and ally in Michigan, Casey, who is with the Michigan Advocates to End Seclusion and Restraint. And, when you talk about sending people that are out there that are doing things, she's one of those people that has heard the call, is doing something, and making change. I've got a friend here as well, Floyd Hyman, who is like, oh heavens, that looks like Sandy Bloom. I know he's a huge fan of your work. So hopefully we'll get some other folks telling us where they are from, and joining with us, what they're interested in. So let's go back a little bit. You've been doing this work for some time now, and of course, the idea of trauma, the impact of trauma, is not something that has always been around. Certainly we can go back to the 70s and 80s to begin to see some things happening there. But tell us about kind of your early, what led you here? What led you to this interest in, everything from the research and the publication you've done around this topic? What was the beginning of that?
Well, I was listening to an earlier podcast you did with my friend Maggie Bennington Davis, and Maggie told you a story about how when as a child, that she found seclusion and restraint soul killing, because and she attributed that in part to having fallen out of a tree as a little kid and hurt her elbow and needed many surgeries. And when I listened to that, I went, oh, because I had my first surgery when I was 3, like for my eyes. And there's a story that my mom used to say that I used to, after I came out of the OR and woke up, they had tied down my hands, and I went, and I was screaming, give me my hands, give me my hands. And my doctor, who I loved, came up to me and very respectfully said, and I'm 3, and said, Sandy, I will undo your hands if you promise not to touch your bandages. I promise. And he let go of my hands. And I'm 3. Okay. So it's about, I think those early formative experiences that children have with adults of being respected as human beings and who have feelings. So I think that's where it all started for me, now that Maggie triggered that that memory. But I started in psychiatry as a teenager, and I was a mental health tech on Temple Hospital's psychiatric unit. And in my whole training experience as a psychiatrist, I never worked in a locked psychiatric unit. At the time, programs were open and voluntary, and there was very little seclusion or restraint. I don't remember that happening much at all. I don't ever remember, as a staff person, being put in that position to have to try to restrain somebody. It was just not done in those days. And I think that's the historical perspective is important for people to know something about, so that until really things changed in the 1980s, pretty much all psychiatric units, except for the state hospitals, were open, voluntary places where there was very little seclusion and restraint that was being used. Now, that history goes back a long way. This issue of secluding people and then getting rid of seclusion and restraint is not new. It's been going on. It's been cycling for several hundred years. So in the 18th century, when people were being routinely locked up and abusively treated, in France and in England, there started to be a movement to Pinel in France. And then in England, it was a bunch of Quakers. And it started with a trauma. So an 18-year-old girl was put into a local asylum in York, England. And this is like in the late 18th century. And she wasn't allowed to have visitors. And the people in her Quaker meeting wanted to try to see her. They weren't allowed in. And within a couple of weeks, she had died. And they investigated. And they saw that this place where she had been kept, this asylum, was horrible. And they said, this is never going to happen to another member of our meeting again. So there was a coffee merchant named Tuke, and they created what became known as moral treatment.
Hmm.
And moral treatment, the idea behind that was that people have not lost their mind. They are having a lot of trouble,
Hmm.
and they shouldn't be restrained, and it should be a social setting that's beautiful, that's filled with nature, and there has to be routine, and there has to be structure, and there has to be people who are tolerant of eccentricity, but who will work with them as staff people. And pretty soon, in England, in every county, there was a site of moral treatment. And the first site of moral treatment in America was in 1817, and it was Friends Hospital in Philadelphia. And it wasn't okay to do any of this kind of seclusion and restraint. And that's in a hospital, in a
Right.
psychiatric hospital, much less a school.
Right.
And then what happened was, and the recovery rates, when you read about them, were astonishing. Like 75% of the people admitted to various hospitals
Hmm.
recovered, never had to be readmitted.
Hmm.
This is before there were any medications. This is before there was any kind of treatment except social care, right? And then what happened was, because they were so successful, local counties started sending people to these hospitals who really were not treatable. So in those days, a lot of people with tertiary syphilis, a lot of people with dementia, who really they were not curable.
Hmm.
And then the cure rates, therefore, went way down, and the places became huge, and they ended up being our gigantic state hospitals.
Hmm.
So the inspired administrators who originally were into moral treatment left and were replaced by people who had to manage these very huge bureaucracies. And
Hmm.
that's how we ended up in post-World War II in the 70s with having to deinstitutionalize people.
Hmm.
So that is really important to understand, because all we've done in terms of adult mental health, since closing the mental hospitals, was build more prisons.
Hmm. Hmm.
So we just have prisons that are filled with people who have all kinds of mental illness. And then it's important that another important part of my life history, historically, is that after World War II, it began in the United Kingdom, was the development of democratic therapeutic communities. And it was a result of psychiatrists who had been on the battlefield with soldiers, and
Hmm.
who saw people who had what we now call PTSD, and then it was called combat trauma. And they saw that social engagement really helped people to heal pretty
Hmm.
quickly and
Hmm.
recover.
Hmm.
And so that's the origin of a lot of the group therapeutic approaches. And there was a psychiatrist named Maxwell Jones, British, who really wrote extensively about how important it was for the patients to be involved in their own
Hmm.
treatment.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
They had to create the environment of safety. The first democratic therapeutic community in the United States was in Oakland, California, at a Naval Hospital. And at that time, when these men were being admitted all over the place for combat trauma, there was a lot of violence in these programs.
Hmm.
So and in this particular program in Oakland, there was none. And the naval officials went to find out what in the world is this guy doing. He was a psychiatrist named Harry Wilmer. And how can it be that there's no incidents here and there's nobody being tied up and restrained and none of that is happening?
Mm-hmm.
And they asked Harry about that when they went out that, and he said, I know it sounds really simple, but the thing is the norms of the community just do not allow the violence.
Mm.
Those were the people that taught me, right?
Right.
That's what
Right.
I saw as a mental health tech and then a medical student and then a psychiatric resident at Temple Hospital were people who knew all this, who had been
Mm-hmm.
schooled in all this, who that was their philosophical point of view. Is
Mm.
that if you treat people with respect, if you really want to help them, if you treat them as people instead of that they're cuckoo,
Right.
then they will respond.
Right.
And if you create a community where you have safe norms, then there will not be violence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's what I saw. That's what I thought was normal. And so when I created my own program, well, those were the principles that we used. And
Right.
so
Right.
we didn't have people being violent.
Right, right, right. So let me just take a quick break and do one thing here real quick. And there's a lot that you've got going on in my head here from that, from what you've shared, and I appreciate the history that you've shared there, which is fascinating and at the same time, oh, a little demoralizing. I mean, to know that, when you look back and go, well, here was a group and they knew better and they were doing better, and then to see where we are. But before I get into that, I just want to share with you a couple of other folks have joined. Somebody here from Tennessee. We've got Alex here from New Jersey, Melanie from South Jersey. We've got Amy here from Massachusetts, and a friend and colleague, Gail, in Australia, where it is 5 a.m. So she helped make me honest here when I said we have people all over the world, as did Balji, who is in New Zealand. I've got a familiar name here, Lynn Stevens in Florida, and let you connect the dots there on the last name. Somebody else here from South Jersey. So we've got a number of people that have joined on, and Mira as well from New Zealand. So I just wanted you to kind of have a sense of where folks were joining us from today, and it's great to always see that. So you've shared a lot in that, kind of setting the stage and providing some of the history, and I have this this immediate response of like, you're saying things. I'm like, well, of course. Well, of course it's really, well, of course it's people want to be seen and feel valued. And these things seem so inherently simple, yet it's not the direction that things have gone. And you mentioned, you mentioned prisons, and one of our focuses here at the Alliance is the school to prison pipeline. We know that the kids that are being restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, subjected to corporal punishment, these are kids that are very often being pushed down that school to prison pipeline. And when we talk about things like physical restraint, seclusion, these are often 5 and 6 year olds. These aren't 18-year-olds with a chip on their shoulder. These are very young children that very early on are being forced to comply, not having their voice heard. And many of the children we're talking about are individuals with disabilities. Black and brown children are more likely to have these things happen. And of course, the broader context here, and I think one that well, is it's kids with a trauma history. It's kids that already have probably suffered many consequences throughout their lifetimes, even as early as birth. I mean, we think about early trauma. I think about the work of people like Dr. Bruce Perry, and those first several months and how critical they are. When no one's responding to a baby, or in the inverse, they are being responded to. All of this has an impact, and you can look at the kids that I talk about that are often misunderstood. Not only is it kids with disabilities, black and brown kids with a trauma history, but you can look further and kids that were adopted or in foster care, and that connection you made there. this is really upsetting to me. And Sandy, I agree with you that and when I say we, not just the two of us, but everybody else listening, everybody that they know, we need to do something about this because you look at our prisons, our prisons and jails. 60% of the individuals in there have been identified with some form of disability. We are failing people when they are going from school and being treated in ways like this, and they're going to prison. So, I really appreciate the historical context that you brought into that. Oh, but really, isn't it frustrating to think? I mean, you came into this, and it sounds like fortunate to be brought into a time and a space and with people that saw the world in the way that now you see it, and you've helped others to see it. But we have so many people out there that they look at their role as to manage, as to manage people. They're missing out on the importance of connecting and treating people like they would want their loved ones to be treated. Yeah. So anyway, I appreciate that intro, and again, this goes to why change is so important. This goes to why organizations, like we mentioned in the beginning here, CTIPP, the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, why groups like that are so critical, because we've got to change systems. I mean, you mentioned how this all ended up in, again, back into these spaces. And, I think about, and I've often shared, that, how did restraint seclusion end up in schools? Well, gee, before, the early 70s, kids that had disabilities weren't allowed to come to school. And when the predecessor to the IDEA law was put into place, and kids began to get access to education, there were misguided practices that were carried over from many of these facilities that weren't doing things right. And now, I mean, gosh, we go back to the 70s again. We go back 50 years, and you would think that these things wouldn't still be happening, that we would have more knowledge and better ways, but we don't seem to be there yet. So let's continue on with your journey, but let's think about what we can do to help get there as we do this. So tell me more about developing your approach. So of course, one of the things that you're well known for is the presence model. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of the approach that you began to create? And of course, we're not just talking about restraint seclusion. Those are things that are done to people in both mental health settings and in schools and in other places. But really, what we're often talking about is people that have been traumatized, people that have are having a difficult time, that aren't getting the supports and are suffering. We're talking about better ways to support all human beings. So talk to me about how kind of where things went from there for you.
Sure. I think what we started just because of a couple of people, really, individual patients of ours on our unit. We started to recognize that their psychiatric problems, very diverse picture, had originated in childhood with childhood adversity. And this is 1985. And so the ACEs study wasn't out yet, but it became really obvious that was where things started going wrong for these folks who were adults. And I think that's important for everybody to realize. The children that are being poorly handled today are going to grow up and be adults. And there are going to be consequences to what's happening. So we had to, it was shocking. And fortunately, I was in a team of people, so I didn't have to be by myself. But it was startling to realize what all these people had experienced as children, particularly the enormity of sexual abuse was just shock. How could this possibly be? And yet it was. And we had to re-gear everything we did. We had to rethink it. We had to learn from our patients, because they had the expertise about how this had all impacted them. And the field of traumatic stress didn't even get off the ground until 1985. And that's just as we were coming into all this. So we had this inpatient unit. We had to figure out how to actually help people to recover and heal. And all my original work in Sanctuary came from that.
Hmm.
That you had to have clear norms, you had to empower people to figure out how their what had happened to them as children had impacted them across their development. And around 1991, my colleague Joe Foderero was a social worker. Joe, we were in a team meeting trying to figure out what all this meant for us. And he said, well, so we've stopped asking people what's wrong with them. And now we ask what happened to them. And that's
Mm-hmm.
changed everything. And that's become, as you know, kind of a social meme.
Right.
But it was really Joe and who said it. And
So
that's
there needs to be an asterisk on the bottom of Bruce Perry's
that
book,
to
right?
be exactly. It's Joe Foderero, 1991. I
Yeah.
published it in 1994.
Yeah.
And it changed everything for us. And we had to also, which is part of how difficult it is to really become trauma aware, is that you have to deal with your own history.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just work with other people. You got to also deal with what life has done. And you have to realize this is a multi-generational thing. This treatment of children, maltreatment of children, has been going on for thousands of years. It's not new.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nobody that isn't affected. It's just denied. So we've become, I believe, a trauma organized culture, where what I mean by that is everything we do, our ideologies, our belief systems, our systems as a whole, are actually organized around this past history of multi-generational trauma that has been completely denied in our explanations of why people do what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets us to the issue of behavior. So in the 1980s was really, I started to see a marked change in my field. It became all about using medications, and behaviorism took over. We completely forgot about the mind, about the unconscious, about
Mm-hmm.
what motivates people. And it was just focusing on behavior. And I think that's where a lot of people got really stuck, because it's impossible. You can't change behavior without understanding the human being who's in
Right.
front of you.
Right. Right.
And that means you have to understand their past, and you have to have some empathy. You have to understand their emotional development. You have to understand attachment. You can't just change behavior. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't
Mm-hmm.
work. And I think that's what a lot of people in the school systems now are up against. But what they don't understand, I'm old. This is why I have this historical perspective, because I've lived through all this. But what younger people who are school teachers wouldn't know, that behaviorism took over in the 1980s.
Right.
I trained in a program where all the psychodynamic people constantly fought with the behaviorists in
Mm-hmm.
the late 1970s, and the behaviorists won.
Mm-hmm.
And so it became all about figuring out how to control
Right.
behavior using
Right.
drug
Right.
or using any kind of intervention that would control behavior. And it doesn't work.
Yeah,
And
no,
so
you're 100%, and it is certainly at root. I mean, again, historically, wouldn't it be great to think that we were leaps and bounds ahead of where we were in the '80s, but we're not. The
Mm,
grasp that behaviorism has on our schools is it's hard to wrap your mind around. I mean, behaviorism is the lead behavioral approach being taken in schools, and not only is it probably not an effective approach with anyone, it's leading to a lot of harm with some. There are a lot of kids that are on the wrong side of rewards and punishments. And again, whether it's some way of manipulating behavior, and then that's what you said earlier. We need to connect. We need to understand the way the brain works. We need to, it's not just about stimulus response and, okay, well, you did a behavior. I'm gonna, do something to you here, and we're gonna change that behavior. But that is the model that is so prevalent. And for I don't know, how much you've been tuning into some of the growing controversy. And I'd like to think that maybe in some way groups like ours and others out there might be helping to grow the controversy, but around behaviorism, around approaches that are very behaviorally driven. In fact, ABA, one such approach that has gotten a tremendous amount of pushback in recent years from the autistic community, and rightfully so. I appreciate the idea of evidence-based practice, but if your evidence doesn't include the perspective of the people that are involved, you miss something that's critical. So for whatever it's worth, Sandy, I do think that we're seeing a growing movement, and it's still a really tiny voice. Again, these behavioral approaches are still prevalent in most places, but we're beginning to hear that movement, I think, picking up, and people are questioning. People are questioning, like you said, behavior is far more than stimulus response. Stuart Schenker, who I think really highly of, often talks about behaviors biology, right? It's more than just, communication is a great thing to say. Yeah, it's communication, but it's more than that. It's the impact of trauma. It's the neurotransmitters in our brain. It's so many more things that are happening. And when we take that very shallow view of, okay, you're not doing something that I like, so I'm either going to offer you a reward or a consequence to somehow manipulate your behavior, that's not how we really help people.
Mm-mm. No, and I think the way I think about it is that I affirm when teachers or parents or anybody in mental health says, well, they're just trying to get attention through their behavior. It's absolutely true. That is absolutely true. That person is trying to get the attention of the other part of their own mind. So behavior, all of what we've learned, what's really one of the things we've learned about trauma and what makes it so critical is that during a traumatic event, during an overwhelming event, your left dominant hemisphere, which thinks and is based on words and is linear, and gives you a sense of time, that part of our mind goes offline and is overwhelmed. And when we're still taking in information, but we're taking it in our bodies and in our sensations and in our emotions. So by definition, trauma fragments us, internally, fragments our minds. And so people then have to get whole, to heal, Humpty Dumpty has to get put back together again, right? And the behavior that people are doing is basically, it's signaling.
Yep.
Because that part of the mind doesn't have words. So it can only signal through behavior, and it's signaling what it needs to stay and what it needs the other part of its mind to know. But the other part of its mind doesn't want to know because it's about trauma. It's scary. It's painful. And so there is this conflict within the person. And then when we step in and abuse them more, that is not going to help them to heal.
Right.
It's all backwards.
Right.
And that's what makes this whole issue of trauma informed such a big deal, is that it's really a way of conveying to the whole everybody that mental illness is a result of being injured. And you can be injured at the level of your genes. You could be injured at neurobiologically. You can be injured in every conceivable way because we are so complex. But it's all about injury, not sickness. And that changes everything.
Mm,
And that's what makes the study of understanding trauma and adversity such a big deal, and why it has to be integrated into the schools, and why the
absolutely.
only way we're going to undo this craziness is to understand what are they signaling? What are they
Mhm,
trying to tell us?
mhm,
Listening, empathy, caring, relationship, making it safe enough for people to struggle and put into words. Yeah, and the things that have happened in the schools, like eliminating the arts, eliminating anything that isn't
mhm.
academic, is a disaster,
Right,
because how do people heal naturally if they're not in therapy?
right.
Because this problem is so enormous, we're not going to have enough therapy, that it just not
Mhm, mhm,
conceivable. So we
mhm,
have to so what has to happen in the schools, which I would say used to happen, was that writing, drawing, painting, acting, all of those modalities that are often marginalized or completely eliminated from the academic environments are actually ways that children can find to
mhm,
heal,
mhm,
and
mhm,
always have.
mhm,
And
mhm.
I know that because we used all those modalities in treatment. We had psychodrama, art therapy, movement therapy. We used it all. It was critical. That just talking to me, that wasn't enough. That would
Mhm,
never
mhm, mhm.
that would never be enough, because that's only the one side of the brain.
Right, right. Well,
It
you know what's really interesting, Sandy, is that one of the things that I've heard, and you've heard, and we've all probably heard that are listening. Well, the kids are just so different today. You know, the kids, and there's this projection of the problem all being on the kids. Yet, you know, if you look at what's changed in schools, as you mentioned, you know, the high stakes testing, the idea that, well, and you know, I had this discussion with somebody recently. This idea that, well, schools are just there to teach them the academics. No, schools are there to help raise human beings, right? You
right.
don't, because a 5-year-old or 6-year-old is not somebody that's just there to learn academics. They're learning to be a person and to work with other people and so many other things. But you know, I think the projection is often, well, the kids are different, the kids have changed, and yet we've got systems. I mean, if you think about our work around systems that support mental health, if we look at our prisons and our schools, you know, these are three huge systems that could change and have so much impact, but it's not happening. In fact, we often see the opposite happening of the directions we should be heading, especially when things are difficult. You know, when we're out there trying to encourage people to look at, you know, trauma informed, you know, neuroscience aligned approaches to supporting, you know, kids at school. There's someone else saying, well, these behaviors, kids need more consequences. Kids need more consequences, you know, and not realizing that no, that's not the answer here. I don't know of any kid that gets suspended and somehow that's a positive, you know, learning experience for them. So we've got a lot of change that needs to happen. I want to pause for a second and just look at a couple of questions here, and a couple of comments. Cassie says, how can we use the wisdom from this history to inform our actions today? And I'm sure you thinking about the work that you've been involved with, probably have a good thought on that.
Sorry about my dog barking. There's probably a delivery at the front door, and she's a very good guard
Oh,
dog.
it's that time.
Uh,
But you know, for us, it's around 3:30 to 4:30 is you know, time for Amazon, FedEx, whoever else
that's
might be
right.
there.
I'm sure they're
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Um, I think what's really important about the history, and why I really wanted to talk about it, is that uh, it was important for me to know who my ancestors were, not my physical ancestors, but my mental ancestors. It was really important to know that the ideas that I was talking about around sanctuary and now about presence have a long backdrop, and it just made me feel more certain that we were on the right track. And I think that's what the why it's so important to know the history, is to give us confidence, to give us a surety that when we meet resistance, there's going to be resistance, because these things keep cycling. But the time is now to push this cycle in a new direction. And I think that's what history why it's so important that we understand that this is not the first time. This is not all brand new. It's not a fad. It's just that we now know more. We know more about trauma. We know more about what kids are going through. We know more about what parents are going through and how
Mhm.
hard it is to parent children today. We know now a lot about attachment that we didn't used to know, and yet the roots of that go back hundreds of years. So that's why I think it's important, Cassie. And
Mhm.
thanks for the question.
Mhm. I've got a comment here from Gail, who's in Australia. Gail says there's a big focus here in Oz now that schools are only allowing children who display inappropriate behaviors to attend school on a restricted part time basis for a long period of time. These are the very kids that need school. And here begins the funnel to the school to prison pipeline. So sad. Of course, we see this here in the United States as well. We see, and of course, the U.S. Department of Education has issued guidance on that, but we see a lot of shortened school days. Oh, they just can't handle being here. Well, what do we need to do when I see a kid that's being restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, somehow excluded, a shortened school day? What I really see is a human whose needs we've not figured out and we aren't meeting, right?
Right, exactly. I think I work with the Lakeside Global Institute,
Hmm.
and part of what they do a lot of training, but um, they also run 4 alternative schools. So these are those kids then from the local counties around Philadelphia, get sent from the public system to the lakeside schools. And those are trauma informed schools. They focus on emotional regulation. They teach kids all kinds of skills to manage their own behavior so that they can learn. And they're getting really very good results. And I think those probably it's happening in a lot of different parts of the country. But what those we have to understand that those alternative schools then are basically our laboratories, right? They're the
Mhm.
laboratories with what needs to be for all kids because we know the
Mhm.
rate of
Right,
exposure is
right.
so high. So it needs to be in all of the schools, not just alternative schools. So because that's not the long-term solution. All kids need to feel safe.
Right, right. And the things that you're going to do to help a child that has, maybe more trauma or more needs is going to help every child.
Exactly.
The idea of universal approaches and universal design, really is the way to go. But you mentioned those schools, and of course, the flip side of that is that many of those specialized programs are not better, but they're worse. They're more focused on behavioral control and behaviorism, and we see a lot more. To give you an idea. Um, Looking at data from 4 years ago because it's what's in my head right now at this moment. But Maryland, in my state, we had I think about 28,000 restraints and seclusions that happened across the state. Half of those came from the non-public schools, which serve a small fraction of students. So you had this really high number of things happening to kids, things being done to kids that came from a very small percentage. But there are, I mean, my son is actually graduating from a non-public program, and it's a fantastic program. They're trauma informed, they're relationship based.
Yep.
He's done really well there, but there are many programs that aren't doing it. Jennifer mentioned here, OMG, following the lead of the individual, that they know best. Yes, 100%.
Yep.
Gail said, love this. People have to deal with their own historical trauma to be trauma informed. Absolutely.
Right.
Uh, let's see. Amy mentioned big pharma greed. Now, so we certainly know that there have been more pushes towards medication, and medication can be a wonderful thing. It can be a helpful thing. Um, but do you think that? I mean, we find sometimes, kind of in this work, that um, school personnel that who shouldn't be are pushing kids towards medication. We don't want to see that. I mean, if you're going to be talking about medication, I think it needs to be coming from appropriate sources. But do you think that that's part of the issue as well, that
We have
rather than
we have an enormous problem with polypharmacy of children.
Mhm.
It's enormous. Um, with kids being diagnosed with 5 different diagnoses and put on 6 different medications. It is really frightening. It's bad with adults, but it's terrible with children. I work with a program, I advise a program that's an online treatment program for kids, and their head psychiatrist is really dedicated. It's called Charlie Health, and their head psychiatrist is dedicated to trying to reduce the polypharmacy because he sees so much of it. Kids on drugs that are powerful, that may or may not be helping them in the least, that may be sedating them a lot,
Mm-hmm, hmm.
slowing them down, but that's not going to get to the root of the problem.
Right, right.
So it is a huge problem across the country.
Yeah, and we happen to be very much in the mindset of kind of supporting and affirming neurodiversity. I mean, people have different brains. Brains are wired differently. I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that, in fact, have always seen that as something we need. The world needs the outliers, right? The bell-shaped curve, it's pretty boring at the top of the bell sometimes. We need people that look at things and see things differently. But again, and there's a comment here Sherry shared, talking about, we were talking about ABA and said it was touted as a cure for autism. ABA was and still is all the rage because they can train like an animal. Parents are impressed by this. And again, I think the roots there are behavioral. The roots
Yeah.
there are, how do we change behavior? And it's about, the behavior that we see. But again, first of all, in kind of that vein of being neurodiversity affirming, we need to move beyond kind of the idea that neurotypical expectations of behavior are always the right expectations of behavior. There are things that are done to individuals in the name of behavior because it's not perceived as a desirable behavior. My son, for many years on his IEP, had something about making eye contact. If you are neurodivergent, eye contact might be uncomfortable physically
Right.
and very difficult. And I stood up at an IP meeting one day and was like, why is this on here? This shouldn't be on here. My son doesn't need to look at anybody to hear the 5 conversations that are going around him. But, there is a lot about compliance and control. And I think, if we look at the world today, whether it be our schools or law enforcement, these ideas behind compliance and control are part of the problem. It's about, it's that's not a trauma informed approach, overpowering somebody to do the things you want them to do.
No, but it has a lot to do with money.
Right.
Um, that the less staffing there is, the more emphasis there is on compliance and control, because environments do become quite unsafe when there's not enough people who are well trained, and who can supervise each other. Right there, then there are more problems, and it is scarier. So I don't think we should pretend that knowing about trauma is going to fix everything. No, there has to be more funding for social
Mhm.
services, for mental health services, for healthcare, for education. We have to change our and for parenting,
Right. Right.
for daycare, and for parental leave, and all of that. I mean, if we as a culture care about raising healthy children, then we have to completely reset our priorities, including our financial priorities, as a
Mhm.
whole culture, not just as individuals.
I agree.
And that's a huge issue, because it's what I saw happen in my own experience, because we had to keep moving our program, and we had to keep moving our program because the money stream changed. And money in all organizations is food. I believe that organizations are living beings, and they need food. And food for an organization is funding. And when there's not enough funding, the organization gets starved, and everybody else in it becomes a victim of starvation.
Mm.
So when that happens, we had to keep moving our program. And each time we had to move, we were less and less funding, less and less staff, less and less space. until finally I closed the program because it was like we were going to do it with no staff. You
Mhm.
can't. That makes for a really dangerous situation. So
Mhm.
I think we have to contend with the bigger system issues too that
Mhm. Mhm.
are we've we as a people we have gone along with funding being vastly underplayed and reduced for all of our social services. And no wonder they're having such a hard time. No
Mm.
wonder people are leaving in droves. Why should you
Right.
have to not be able to, why should you have to work 3 jobs because you want to do a do a job that helps people? But
Yeah.
but in reality, that's what's happening.
Right. And that's a really important point because it's easy as we talk about this to look at the world the way it is and to be upset and to be frustrated, and to want change. And I think that's normal, and that's probably okay to a degree. But if we think about these areas that we're talking about here, whether it be schools or whether it be the mental health profession or even law enforcement, we're often talking about people that are going into careers that honestly are doing so because they want to do good for the world. They
Mhm.
want to help people, and no educator becomes a teacher and thinks, oh, I want to restrain and seclude a child. They get into a situation where, I think part of the problem is, we have a lot of outdated ideas and approaches that are still being taught in higher education. I mean, quite frankly, it doesn't stop in practice. Higher ed is still lagging behind, probably a
Yeah.
couple of decades on some of this information. But I think it is important to be aware and compassionate. When we talk about trauma, people that are working in situations where they're understaffed, where they're, and again, in kind of really thinking about this, I'm not sure that I would have had a tremendous amount of empathy initially when what happened to my son. But after learning more and learning more about all of this, I have a lot of empathy, even for the person that might be restraining somebody. There is nothing pleasant about restraining a child. That, in fact, is traumatic. And of course, we know that trauma can lead to changes in the brain of the people that are doing these things and actually make them more apt to do them again in the future because they don't feel safe. So, part of this is culture, part of this is education. Um, and again, there are a lot of, I think, people that really do want to do the right thing and make a positive change, but there's no easy road to that in some cases. Um, yeah, so I mean, it's hard, and again, I mean, it is important to, how do we bring these changes about? I think about earlier, Cassie had asked the question about something, and Cassie's working on some things in her home state, and really being mindful of, like, how do we make sure when we're doing this that we can bring training along? What do we do? It's not just enough to say don't do these things anymore; they're wrong. But how do we help people to learn, hear the better things we can and should do that are going to not only help the individuals that we serve, but ultimately, I think, are helpful to the teachers, the staff, wherever you might be. I mean, we found, and I'm sure you've seen this as well. I was thinking earlier about Pennsylvania, and have you? I'm going to guess maybe you have. Are aware of Gregory Smith's work? Gregory did a lot of work in the state hospital system and
Ah,
reducing the use of
okay.
restraint seclusion. Had written a
Right.
bunch about it, but
Yeah.
um, when you think about, systems that have been successful in bringing about changes like this, um, it's not easy. It takes a lot of work to shift away from approaches, even when we might know that they're not working for us. So this is tough. So I want to follow up here with a question. And this was one from Cassie, who said, our teachers are operating without this information. How do we get this information to educators and to others?
Well, good question. I and it relates to what you were just talking about, Guy, too. I think um, we need a lot more training, and I believe, because of my own experience, it's best to do it together, not just by yourself. That to bring about a real shift in a school or any kind of program, you've got to get everybody on board because you don't know who's going to trigger a child. It might be the teacher, it might be the bus driver. So you have to get everybody that is part of the community, and then broaden that out to the larger community that where we all live, right? So that means really training, really thinking about, well, what is training? It's really re-education. And how do we do that? And how do we do that in a cost-effective way? That's why we created Creating Presence, which is all online, so that we could do it. A whole organization could get on this program and do it together, but use online ability and not have to have somebody come to them, but be able to use their our online resources in their programs. So I think there's going to be more and more innovation now that we're all pretty much more comfortable with the online environment because of COVID.
Right.
It may end up being the only positive thing that comes out of that, is that people are more willing to do this kind of thing, to learn in this way, and it's faster and it's more efficient. So that's why we've developed it, and I'm sure lots of other people are doing similar things. So I think you got to look around and see what's available, for and you have to get to the leadership. I mean, that means getting to school boards, educating them first so that they support the initiatives that are going to have to occur. It means in a school making sure that the managers and the leaders of the school are on board and are going to provide the teachers with the time that they need to actually do the training. I mean, we've been learning how challenging it is.
Yeah. So what kind of organizations are going through this training that you talk about? What kind of organizations you see moving through that?
Oh, a lot of mental health resident. Our pilot program was a residential program for children in Canada,
Mm,
actually. And we're still in early days. We didn't release this until during COVID.
mm, mhm, mhm.
So healthcare, mental health care, different kinds of social service agencies, foster care. We don't we don't have many schools yet,
Mhm.
but we could. It's accessible for schools. It's an educational um, platform, so
Mm, mhm, mhm,
it
mhm,
would be
mhm,
possible. But we have some very big healthcare settings that
mhm,
are
mhm.
struggling, and there's an epidemic of burnout, and
Right.
so trying to get programs to take on board new learning when they're already burned out it's asking a lot of
Mhm, mhm,
people.
mhm, mhm,
Um, so it's uphill. You have to spend time overcoming the resistance. You have to make
mhm,
sure you get to key leaders. And
mhm,
from what I've seen across the country, in every community, there is somebody who's passionate about this. Probably a lot of people that are listening to this today
mhm, mhm.
that are, you don't underestimate, even if you're you don't think you're that powerful. Knowledge is power, and
Right.
you have knowledge that other people need. And so don't underestimate the influence that you can have. It may take time. You may have to keep banging on a lot of closed doors for a while, but don't think that because you're not, a big cheese at the top, that there's nothing you can do. That's just not true everywhere.
Absolutely, absolutely. I got into this work after the experience that I had with my son, and it was about 4 years ago. Um, my background was in marine biology, environmental science. I was working a job for a university that I expected I would probably stay at until I retired. But when this happened, I was kind of like, "This is not okay." We've got to do something, and ultimately ended up leaving my job to focus on this work full time. And I'm a firm believer that I mean, I used to. When I would talk about it, just say, look, I'm just the dad. That's it. I'm just the dad. I had this experience. did a deep dive, started learning what I could, understanding what I could. And, we can become change makers. We can become influential if we, really put out some effort. And I think sometimes people are surprised with how much they really can do. It's not easy. It's not easy at all, but it's work worth doing for sure. Want to get to a quick question here from my friend Floyd. Floyd says, we talked quite a bit about the school to prison pipeline and not on much of the school to cubicle pipeline. Okay. I've heard you discuss the C word in other interviews. Can you talk on how to make sanctuary and spaces that are created for making the next workforce, which necessitates the prison pipeline instead of whole beings stepping into creating the world?
Wow, Floyd, you don't ask any easy questions. Oh my
No, no.
God.
Floyd is a deep thinker and somebody
Hey,
that I know well.
Floyd, which C word are you talking about? You got to tell me that first. The C word. You've heard me discuss the C word. Which C word?
All right. Well, we'll see. We'll see if Floyd tells us that. I assumed as I read it because he had mentioned cubicle in the
Oh,
preceding
okay.
sentence that maybe that was what he meant. So hopefully
Not so
he'll.
sure though. He capitalized it, so I'm not sure. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so uh, I think what you're referring to is, how do we create workplaces that are safe and that help people be creative and innovative. That C word,
There it
capitalism.
is. There it is. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. That C word. That's why I had to ask. Um, I think, I have, where I get hope is for the young people who are coming up, because I think they are much more fully aware than us baby boomers were that if we don't act soon, we are going to kill all life on Earth. It's that simple. And um, I think they're scared. I think they're anxious, and they're not sure yet how to direct their energy. But it is going to mean um, adjusting to a different economic system than the one we have, because capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, is no longer working. It's killing us. It's killing us. It's killing the planet. It's killing the people we care about. Um, that does not mean I'm the other C word, which is a communist. I don't even know for sure what a communist is. I grew up in the 50s. so, so I just know that our system has to change. It's not working, and it's killing us, and it's killing the whole planet. And it's even going to kill the really rich people because they have no place else to go. So I think we have to talk about that just like we are now, and really have meaningful conversations about, well, what does that look like, and what are we each going to have to give up in order to make it change. um and we have to elect people who give a shit about this, about everything that we're talking about,
Mhm.
which we're not currently, haven't been very good at. So it means changing the government, which seems to be completely stalled. And well, at least we didn't destroy the world economy yesterday. That's
Mhm,
good.
mhm, mhm.
Um, but there's so many things that are wrong with a country that is supposed to be in a leadership position, and we're losing all that. And I'm hoping that we will get it, that this is about children,
Mhm.
that this really, our future is about raising healthy children. And
And that's the
we
key.
need, that's the key.
Right, right.
If
You
you,
want a better future? You raise
and
healthy children.
you raise
Yep.
healthy kids who have not been abused, who have not been exposed to being beaten up as children, who have not been sexually abused, who are respected and loved and cared for. That's all the change that would have to happen. But that means in order to get healthy children, you have to take care of young parents. You have to make it possible for parents to do the work they need to do. You have to have high quality daycare so that a woman at work doesn't have to worry about what's happening to her child in a daycare center. There's enough money for it to be paid for, that parents can take leave when they have a new baby. I mean, there's so much wrong that other developed countries do, that other countries in Europe and Australia and New Zealand do those things. And the idea, and I'll just pause and let Guy have a word for a minute. The idea, this is the only country in the world that has refused to ratify the
Yep.
UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The only country in the world is the United States of America.
Yeah.
And that says everything. That in 1975, there were two African American psychiatrists who wrote an article that was published in a psychiatric journal, and it was about childism. And they said that our most basic form of oppression is of children. And I think they were totally right. And I think we could in a generation change everything and have a really nice world to live in if we just made children the first priority in
And
all of our
we treat
lives.
them like human beings. We don't treat them
Absolutely.
as a subclass with less, that deserve fewer rights or respect. It's funny because you went exactly where I was thinking, which is about the UN Convention of the Children, and so I mean, there's a lot there's a lot that needs to change. So let me shift gears here as we kind of wind down. We've covered a lot of ground, and there are just comments all over the chat, and I certainly won't have time to get to them all. But let's kind of end on a hopeful note. Let me ask you, Sandy. Um, you've done this over your career. You've done things to bring about changes, and I'm a firm believer that any positive change is a positive change, meaning that something that it's a positive change affecting one person, that's a step in the right direction. If you can change a local law or a state law, that's a step in the right direction. You change federal law, that's
Right.
a bigger step. Anywhere we can make change, I think it's a really good thing. And I'd love to see that CTIP is kind of focused on all those areas as well. But let me ask you this. What gives you hope for the future?
I'm still teaching full time. I'm about to reach 3/4 of a century, and I'm still teaching full time. And it's not just because I need to make a living. It's also because these young people inspire me. They care. They are determined to make a difference. They are activated. They care that there's racism. They care that there's sexism. They care that there's childism. They're determined to do more about it. It's not that nothing that we didn't do anything. We did, but we didn't finish the job, right? And I think they stand a chance of really making a difference and changing the big C word, and really understanding that our economic system has to change if we're going to survive. And they are desperately concerned about the environment and the ecological disasters that are coming.
Yeah,
So
thank goodness.
they're very concerned about the growing potential for fascism to take over this country, which
Mm,
is very real.
mm,
It's happened before. It can happen
right,
again.
right.
So they're really scared about that, and they should be, and we all should be. So that's what gives me hope, Guy, is the generations that are coming up.
Yeah, I agree with you, that's and I'll also say that I'm so glad that you're in the classroom, you're doing what you're passionate about, what you love, but even more, spreading these ideas and the wisdom. Uh, this has been a really great conversation. Um, we have covered a lot of ground here, and I do a lot of these interviews, and this has just kind of gone into some really interesting areas, and I love your passion, and you give me hope, Sandy. You give me hope. I so appreciate your taking some time to join us today. Um, I love you sent me an email earlier about one of your students that's doing some really, and I was thinking as you were talking about the young people, I'm like, yeah, if there's anything that we can do to help support what your students are doing or get their voices out, let us know. We want to do that. But you are definitely somebody, I think, that's brought a lot of hope and positive change to the world. So thank you for all the things that you're doing to make a difference. And with that, I'm going to thank you here in a second and encourage others to put their thanks in the chat. But I want to leave you with any final thought. So any final thought you have as we end our conversation here today?
Oh, I think I got to the big things. Guy, thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you and all of the people who are part of this movement. That it's so critical, and it's so critical for us to get all linked together, for
Right.
like-minded people to come together just in this way and make a change. Oh, look at that.
Did,
That's
did you
really
see,
good.
did you see that from Kelsey? Our
Yeah.
friend uses the term adult supremacy.
Adult supremacy,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
great, I'm gonna
yeah, yeah.
use that. You send me his name, and I'll make sure he gets credit.
There you go. There you go. And of course, your website has contact information for you. We've shared that. A lot of people just putting their thanks here in the chat. Again, well, look at that. Our folks from Australia and New Zealand were here for the whole conversation, despite the fact that it's really early in the morning there. Oops. And just appreciate you joining us. Lots of thank yous coming here. So, with that, we're going to go ahead and end our broadcast here. The thank yous keep rolling in. This has been a great one. I hope that people will share this. Share it with your students too. And if any of them have anything that they want to share, love to hear their voices as well. I'm gonna let our audience go here, and you can hang around for 1 second, Sandy, and we'll just wrap up here. But thank you so much to all of you that joined us. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks. Bye bye.